And it's like such a different way of dealing with things that my mercy at the other end, I'm a mercy. When I was listening to the first teaching about it, I kept thinking, where am I? Because mercy came seventh, so I had to wait. And so my mercy would deal with a situation very, very differently than the prophet. The prophet would say, that was wrong, get on your knees, repent. I have a friend, a pastor, who carries the redemptive gift of prophet, as well as ruler and maybe some other things. And on her office door, as a pastor, she's got these words in large letters, get over it. That's true. Now, because I'm a mercy, you know, mine's probably got to come in and have a cup of tea with us. Because you see how very differently the gifts work out. But, you know, very positively, they want things done excellently. And they tend to be rather intense. And but because the prophet's wanting to, the redemptive gift of prophet is wanting to hear from God, they will not necessarily stand up in a meeting and say, thus says the Lord. That's the gift of prophet with a capital P, and also the gift of prophecy in the list of gifts with tongues, interpretation of tongues, prophecy. They may not, they might well do, but they don't necessarily. But they are carrying this redemptive gift inside, and so they will hear from God. And so they need to refuel, they need time with God. They tend to be a bit more of a loner than some. And most of the people I've seen, this is a personal observation, carrying the redemptive gift of prophet, tend to be called to live fairly sacrificially in the discipline and the faith and commitment. And I know some of you know Andrew Baker. I'm just going to mention I believe he's a prophet with a P, as well as prophecy and a redemptive gift of prophet. So he's kind of got a lot of that. Some of you know him, and I'm just mentioning his name, but because I've seen him go through some hard seasons in his life, because he can tend to be misunderstood, and because you're very straight. And when that redemptive gift is fully lived out, all it does, their root system goes deeper and deeper into God. So you see how God has got this balance thing, and that's what God sees. But of course, all of us have got weaknesses. So the weakness with prophets, the redemptive gift of prophet, is that they can be judgmental because they see very clearly. And because they're black and white, they can be judgmental and less willing to overlook the failures and weaknesses of others. But God's always working on our weaknesses, and our weaknesses don't disqualify us. And so this is not kind of everybody, but because principles and truth are so strong, relationships can be less important. So people with a redemptive gift of prophet, if you want to look in the Bible and see these, we've got Peter, I believe that Caleb was carrying the redemptive gift of prophet. It just looking in the Bible, you know, maybe we can't be totally, but maybe perhaps Naomi in the story, because in the story of Ruth. But because we've got 7 to go through, and I don't got time, we're finishing for lunch, I need to press on quickly. But, you know, I think sometimes, like a lot of prophets, Peter saw something, when he saw it so strongly, he even rebuked Jesus. Do you remember? You better come on one side with me, you'll be all right. You listen to me, and then I think he must have felt terrible afterwards. But that's the prophet. This, as I say, we could just do a study on Peter and bring home everything. Things that enhance the gift, things that weaken the gift. And there's so much. But if we just get a skeleton down, anyway, for now. But the second one in that list in Romans 12 is the servant. So if you're doing notes, if you'd like to write the servant down. Now, you will have more than one of these gifts formed in some degree, but you have one dominant gift. So we have a dominant gift of servant among us, that's Anne. So I will bring Anne out a few times as well as Bible things, because she's taught me a lot about the servant gift, because I see it in operation. And so that is a very, very beautiful gift, and I'm going to just talk to you about some of their characteristics, and then we'll come to the person in the Bible who's carrying it. But the servant sees the need and doesn't have to be asked, would you go and do that? Because the servant sees the need, and their desire is to serve and to meet those needs. And so is totally in that way a team player. So they're not, whether that gets them noticed, whether that gets them an extra strike, it doesn't matter. They've seen the need and they want to serve and fill it. And so they're very, very practical. And, you know, I'm just giving just like an example, but I've never had anybody serve the ministry with me that's been like a step ahead and say, I've done this. You know, sometimes like at these big conferences, you don't get time to eat and properly. But the one who's tapping me on the shoulder, have you had something to drink? Here's a drink. Have you had something to eat? Here's a piece of chocolate, instant energy. But, you know, the bomb, I like plain chocolate, the Bourneville bars are hard to break. You know, you have to have your 2-litre mix to get break the bar. That's the way it uses a few more calories that you can put in. But they're already broken. That is like the servant looking ahead, very, very practical. And because the serving is in the DNA, not something that you have to do, the redemptive gift of serving can get used and abused. you find the servant in the church situation is probably over. It's probably overcommitted because they haven't got many no's. You know, would you do that? Can you do that? Yeah, I'll do it. And so they haven't got a lot of no's. And but they don't need to be in the front, at the front, you know. Anne's not asked if she can share today. I've given her that place because I recognise the gifting in her, but she sees the best, I'm sure, in me, and chooses to overlook the weaknesses, but with high loyalty. But this is the servant who has a totally different reaction, and I want you in these 7 to try and recognise yourself. But because of the nature that God's put in them, the nature of the servant, and Jesus came anywhere and served because he carried all these redemptive gifts, and you see his servant heart. And willing, even though he was God, he was willing to come to the disciples and wash their feet. What kind of a servant heart is that? The Lord of glory, where the angels hide their faces from him, who created the world, comes. What grace to gird yourself with a towel and wash someone's feet. It's a beautiful, beautiful gift. And I don't suppose Anne will tell you that she's a retired surgeon, obstetrician, missionary doctor, 7 years, got so much in her own right. Now, I'm sorry, Anne, I'm just kind of trying to show you how the giftings work within the body. So, everybody in the Bible will have carried one of these redemptive gifts as the dominant gift. If you want to be thinking, as I'm talking about Esther a little bit, she was the biblical example, and because of their personality, they have very few enemies. And so, you know, Esther had incredible favour. You know, she was the favoured one with the king, the favoured one with Haggai, the favoured one. And it's like some people, if they get into a place of authority and position, and they've not got that servant thing, they can have this kind of little Caesar, shall we call it, mentality. But because she was a servant, it said, Haggai asked her, what do you want to take into the king? And she said, well, what do you recommend? Compliant, teachable, easy to get on with. And so if you just we're going with this, but Esther, you know, in the story, Mordecai comes to the gate when he hears the Jewish nation's going to be exterminated, and he's dressed in sackcloth and ashes. But you look and see what Esther does. She sends a negative response, but she sends him some clothes. Straight away, she's looking to serve his need. He perhaps must need some clothes. And it's like a lovely, you know, a lovely thing that's in them. So she didn't say why. She didn't kind of sit in the palace and say, well, I wonder why Mordecai's in sackcloth and ashes. She says, I must get him a new I must get him some new clothes. And so servants are very, very good for a leader to have around. And I'm sure this is one of the reasons that she must have been incredible for the king to have. And of course, she saved the king's life. Because I don't know what would have happened if they'd gone ahead with his plan to exterminate the Jews. So, yeah, I said loyalty was very important, and you'll remember that Esther was kind of, shall I, shan't I help Mordecai? I've not been called to the king for all these days. I've not been called. What shall I do? When Mordecai is trying to persuade her, he talks about loyalty to a family. And that's what eventually turned the argument, and she said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it. And even when, I've spoken on Esther so many times, but she came into her destiny, obviously, when she served the needs of the nation at that time, even at the risk of her own life. But in the end, you know, she and Mordecai served on either side and ruled with the king. But, you know, she was happy to let Mordecai come in and begin to take the spotlight. And that's the lovely thing with servants. And so there's a great purity of motive. So I just want to say that it's a very high calling in God, the redemptive gift of a servant. But the weaknesses of a servant are not great ones, but they're there. One is that they can enable people instead of empowering them. In other words, someone might say, can you show me how to do this? And to show them how to do it would be to empower them. But the servant's likely to enable, the servant's likely to say, I'll do it. The servant's likely to say, I'll do it. You don't have to do it. And then they haven't learned. Do you see what I mean? Because that's what they're doing, they're serving. And of course, because the care and serving, they can have problems with worry and anxiety and things like that. And they can sometimes battle with self-worth. Because they probably don't even see the power of the value of what they're carrying, which is amazing. So that's our quick overview of the servant. Okay? So moving on to the teacher. This is what it says, he who teaches, give himself to his teaching. If your redemptive gift is teaching, then get on with teaching and don't try and be the prophet or the mercy or somebody else. You be who I have intentionally designed you to be, the teacher. And the teacher is somebody who is tends to be very cautious. Now, I believe that a lot of my husband is a teacher. Roy loves to take the word and teach from it. And when something new comes, it takes him a long time to assimilate it and make sure it's right and go and dot every I and cross every T and make sure that everything is right. So, well, let's look at it from this angle. And I think, come on! Oh, hurry up, it's not that hard. And seeing his gift as kind of where he is and where he's at has made it easier for me to understand why he likes that precision in what he's doing. And sometimes there can be a real overkill of details, you know what I mean? Because the detail's important to the teacher. So he makes decisions, the teacher makes decisions very slowly. And it can be a balance to those who kind of, like the prophet, Peter, let's go and build the tabernacle for Jesus. Hey, hang on a minute, the teacher would say. Hang on a minute, don't rush into this. Just think about this, and it doesn't the word say that. And there's your balance. All these things are checks and balances. And so the teacher has a deep commitment to family and can tend to be traditional. So, Roy and I have been married for 46 years, and I can say that he has a commitment, soon 47 years. Getting on for our silver wedding anniversary, but he has golden, yes. So that's someone teacher here is just giving the correct detail. But because they're cautious, they're kind of seen as safe. And so the teacher would be very, very unlikely to preach from the Word of God with personal illustrations about their life and what's going on now, this example and that example. They want to say, it says here, this is that, and that's really good. While we're thinking about Bible, this is why Luke's Gospel, Luke was the teacher. I've set out to give an orderly account of everything that happened, starting from chronological, ordered, detailed, and what should we say? From the teacher's perspective, him as a teacher, he was validating, finding every way he could to validate truth. And that is very, very important. And so these are just some of the things we'll talk about Luke in a moment. But they don't like to just say, well, I've heard this. They like to be able to validate it. So Luke went to Mary. He went first hand and said, what happened? Straight from the horse's mouth. And not round some corner. And so Luke does quite a lot of referring back to Isaiah, because he's the teacher, he's got Isaiah in his mind. He said, yeah, that's what agrees with that. This is totally in agreement with that. It's linking. Okay, that's true. This is where we are, and this is where it's going. They see, like, the whole picture, which is amazing and very, very good. And it's why I'm sure it grieves God when there's come into the church this kind of, I don't know, like the real teachers are perhaps not as honoured now as those who can make you laugh in the pulpit and entertain and talk about life coaching and just maybe just exhort. But the teacher is very, very, I feel very valued in God's eyes. So he just, these quick things on the teacher, because we have a few more to go. But a weakness kind of is that because the mind is so in gear, it can tend sometimes to be at the detriment of the spirit, because they feed the mind more than the spirit. So they're likely to spend more time in the Word than in the presence of God. Do you see what I mean? Now, I know they're both good. What I'm saying is that sometimes the spirit man, if they're processing what they're reading with the mind only and not with a live spirit, people could say, well, they're boring. They could. They could. And I'm sure you've heard very, very accurate teachers who were a bit boring. And it's because they've not fed the spirit to the same degree they've fed the mind. And that's very, very important. And I know that it's a way of preventing truth decay. And so, yeah, they're really an anchor. And so they become quite wise people because they've got all this wisdom. But sometimes they may have a struggle with kind of a bit of pride of how much they know. Sometimes. And so they rely very heavily on their knowledge more than the movement of the Spirit. And so these are the major weaknesses in them, and we'll look at Luke for a moment more. They tend to be a bit staid and tend to be a little bit passive. And so because they're so intellectual, they can be a bit slow, procrastinate on practical things because their mind's thinking about whatever. And they prefer to live by sight rather than by faith. That would be their preference. And so intimacy, as I say, with God and prayer can be a bit of a battle. And the doctrinal issues and system are kind of strongly in them. So if you get a teacher who also has that intimacy with God, then that teaching gift is at its optimum. And that's important. So we can't go a lot into details, but Luke, for example, he's wanting people to read his gospel in years to come